It was late September when I decided to go camping alone. I had been working long weeks, stuck inside an office with only the view of a parking lot to remind me that the world outside still existed. My life had become routine: work, home, sleep, repeat. I needed a break. I wasn't a stranger to camping. I had spent years hiking through forests, fishing in quiet lakes, and sleeping under the stars. It wasn't about the thrill of survival for me. It was about the peace, the quiet, the escape from everything else. I picked a spot I had been to once before, a remote area near a slow-moving river, deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It wasn't a place that drew many people. It was too far from the main road, too inconvenient for casual campers. That's exactly why I liked it. The plan was simple. I would drive up on a Friday afternoon, set up camp by the river, spend the weekend fishing, and head back Sunday morning. No phone, no emails, just me and the wild. The drive up was uneventful. The last stretch was a dirt road, winding through miles of trees before it ended near a clearing by the water. I parked my truck near the edge of the clearing, grabbed my gear, and walked down to the riverbank to set up camp. The river was exactly as I remembered it. Clear water moving lazily over smooth stones, lined by thick trees on either side. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the occasional bird calls and the steady rush of the river. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, close enough to hear the gentle flow but far enough to stay dry if the water rose overnight. I built a small fire pit, unpacked my supplies, and sat down on a fallen log, letting the silence settle over me. It was perfect. As the sun started to set, I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and let the heat of the flames warm my hands. The woods felt peaceful. No distant voices, no sounds of cars, just the crackling fire and the river's steady murmur. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the outside world. I fell asleep easily, the exhaustion from the week catching up with me. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, barely noticeable over the river, but it was there, a soft rustling, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, my ears straining. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I wasn't worried. I had been in the woods enough times to know that the wildlife usually kept its distance. Then I heard it again, closer, a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps moving through the dry leaves. I held my breath. There was no reason for another person to be out here. No other cars at the clearing, no signs of other campers on the way in. Just me. The footsteps stopped. I listened for what felt like minutes, but there was nothing. Just the river, the fire's last embers cracking softly outside. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet of the woods. I turned over, closed my eyes, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise when I stepped out of my tent. The air was crisp, the grass damp with morning dew. I stretched, grabbed my fishing gear, and walked down to the river. The water was cold against my hands as I set up my line and cast it into the current. I sat there for hours, watching the water, feeling the weight of stress slowly lift from my shoulders. Then, as I reeled in my line, I noticed something. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth near my tent. Barefoot. I froze. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been here. I looked around, scanning the trees, the river, the clearing. Nothing. Just the quiet stillness of the morning. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe another camper passing through. But the footprints led toward my tent, not past it. Whoever it was had stopped right outside. Watching, I packed up my fishing gear, my hands moving quickly, my pulse pounding. I didn't see anything missing, nothing disturbed. Just the footprints, a silent reminder that I hadn't been alone. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe they had been there before I set up camp and I just hadn't noticed. As the sun began to set, I built another fire, but this time, I kept my knife close. Night fell, and I forced myself to lie down in my tent. I didn't sleep. Every sound felt louder, sharper. Every whisper of wind against the trees sent my heart racing. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tensed. Then the sound stopped. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Then the tent moved. Something brushed against the fabric, a slow, dragging touch. I sat up, my grip tightening on the knife. The movement stopped. For what felt like forever, I waited, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and despite everything, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping out into the light, and I saw them, more footprints, leading from the trees, stopping right at my tent, then leading back into the woods. I packed up my gear in minutes. No breakfast, no second thoughts. I threw everything into my truck and drove out of there, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted, but they had been watching me, and they had been close, too close. I haven't been back since. I never thought I would go camping alone, not after she died. We used to do it all the time, me and my wife. Every summer, every fall, whenever we could. It didn't matter if it was too hot or too cold. We'd just pack up, take the truck, and find some quiet place in the woods where no one else would bother us. She loved it. She used to say the silence of the woods made her feel small in a good way, like nothing really mattered except the moment we were in. I couldn't go back for a long time. It took 2 years before I finally convinced myself to do it. 2 years of sitting in the house, looking at the empty chair at the dinner table, walking past her side of the bed, leaving the radio off because I didn't want to hear our old songs. I thought maybe if I went back to the woods, I'd find something of her still there. Not in a supernatural way, nothing like that. Just something in the air, in the trees, in the way the river sounded at night. So I packed my things. I kept it simple. 1 tent, my sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, my hunting knife, and a rifle I barely ever used. I wasn't planning on shooting anything, but it made me feel better having it with me. The drive out took about 5 hours. I went deep into the mountains, far from the city, far from anything. It was the kind of place we used to love, a place where the road turned to dirt and then just stopped, leaving you to hike the rest of the way. I picked a spot near a stream, right at the edge of a thick patch of trees, the kind of place that felt untouched. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and when I stepped out of the truck, I felt something settle in my chest. A weight I'd been carrying for 2 years finally letting up, just a little. I set up camp slowly, taking my time. There was no rush. I built a fire, cooked some canned food, and sat in the quiet, just listening. The woods were alive in a way that the city never was. Even when it was still, you could hear the life around you. Insects buzzing, birds rustling in the branches, the distant sound of water moving over rocks. Felt good. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I went for a walk. I didn't have a real plan, just wanted to stretch my legs and see what was around. I followed the stream for a while, watching the way the sunlight moved across the water. It was peaceful. I thought about her, about the way she used to walk ahead of me, turning back to smile, telling me to hurry up. I thought about the way she used to laugh when she slipped on the wet rocks, always acting like she meant to do it. I must have walked for an hour before I realized I wasn't sure where I was. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was just a feeling, a small knot in my stomach. The stream was still there, but it looked different. The trees seemed thicker, the ground rockier. I turned around and started walking back, but after a few minutes, I wasn't sure if I was going the right way. I stopped. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The sun was still high, so I wasn't worried about daylight running out, but something about the silence around me felt wrong. I kept walking. Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. The stream wasn't beside me anymore. I wasn't sure when I lost it. The trees all looked the same, no landmarks, no familiar signs. My heart started beating a little faster. I told myself to stay calm. I had a good sense of direction, to find my way back. Then I saw it, a cabin. It was old, half rotten, the wood dark with age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front door hung open just enough to see the blackness inside. I didn't remember seeing it on the way out. I was sure of that, but there it was, standing silent in the middle of nowhere, like it had been waiting for me. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. I should have turned around right then. I should have ignored it and kept walking. But I was lost. And maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that could help. A map, old supplies, anything. I stepped closer. The air smelled different near the cabin. Stale, rotten, almost. I peered inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The inside was mostly empty, just a wooden floor covered in dead leaves and dirt. A broken chair sat in one corner, and near the back wall, there was a pile of something. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath me, the sound too loud in the silence. My boots stirred up dust that smelled like mold and decay. I walked toward the pile in the back, my stomach twisting with some kind of deep, animal instinct telling me to leave. It wasn't a pile. It was a bedroll. Old, filthy, covered in stains I didn't want to think about. Someone had been here, recently, and then I saw the knife. It was on the floor near the bedroll, long and rusted. But the rust wasn't all old. Some of it was fresh. Too fresh. I turned and walked out fast, my hands shaking. I needed to go. Now, I didn't care which direction. I just needed to get away from that place. The forest felt different as I moved. The air felt thicker, the light dimmer. I kept walking, trying to listen, trying to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't look back. I kept moving, kept walking faster, then running. Branches whipped against my face. My legs burned. My lungs ached. But I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran. And then suddenly I was at my campsite. The fire was still smoldering, my truck right where I left it. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and got in the truck. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dirt road, not looking in the mirrors, not stopping for anything. I didn't breathe until I hit pavement. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I don't know who was in those woods. I don't know how long they were watching me, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just didn't think things through. The idea sounded simple. Spend a night camping in an abandoned graveyard. Not for fun, not for thrills, just to do it. It wasn't a dare, and I wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was just one of those things that got stuck in my head, and I decided to see it through. I picked a place outside a small town in Oregon, a forgotten cemetery hidden deep in the woods. I had read about it online, how it had been left to rot after the town relocated their dead to a more modern graveyard in the late 1950s. Some graves remained, ignored and lost to time. No caretakers, no visitors, just old stones covered in moss, sinking into the earth. It was early October, and the forecast predicted light rain overnight. That didn't bother me much. I had camped in the rain before, and as long as I kept my gear dry, I'd be fine. What did bother me, though, was the idea of setting up my tent on ground where people had been buried. Even if the bodies were moved, I doubted they got every single one. But again, I ignored the thought. It was just a place. Dirt and trees and broken stones. Nothing more. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my truck on the shoulder of an old road that hadn't seen traffic in years. Thick branches leaned over the cracked pavement, reaching down like skeletal fingers. There wasn't even a proper trail leading to the graveyard, just a narrow path where the undergrowth was thinner. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and started walking. The forest was quiet. Not silent, but quieter than I expected. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just the occasional creak of tree limbs shifting. The path wasn't long, maybe a 10-minute walk, but it felt longer. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was thinking too much about where I was going. When I finally stepped into the graveyard, the first thing I noticed was how small it was. I had expected something larger, but it was barely an acre of land, scattered with crooked tombstones and half-buried markers. The ground was uneven, swallowed by tree roots and erosion. A rusted iron fence lined one side, where the land sloped down into a ravine. The other side was a thicket of trees so dense that it almost felt like a wall. I picked a spot near the edge, close to an old oak tree. The ground there was flat enough for my tent, and the tree gave me some cover in case the wind picked up. I cleared away some dead leaves, avoiding the stones out of respect, or maybe superstition. I set up quickly, securing my rain cover and making sure my sleeping bag was dry inside. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping below the trees, turning the sky into a mix of deep orange and gray. I set up my small camp stove and heated a can of chili, eating it straight from the tin with my spoon. There was something unsettling about eating in a graveyard, but I pushed the thought away. It was just another night outside, just like any other. As the light faded, the quiet turned into something heavier. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, rustling branches, weren't there. It wasn't complete silence, but it was close. I told myself it was the cold air keeping the insects away, but I didn't believe it. I zipped myself into my tent and checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising. I switched it to airplane mode to save battery and tucked it into my backpack. My flashlight cast a weak glow inside the tent, but I turned it off after a few minutes. I wasn't scared. At least that's what I told myself. Lying there in my sleeping bag, I listened. The rain started just after midnight, a light patter against the nylon of my tent. The sound was almost comforting, something normal in an otherwise strange place. I let my eyes close, then I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was movement, slow, deliberate. Leaves shifting, twigs snapping. It was close, just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening harder. The sound stopped. The rain continued, but the footsteps, because that's what they were, footsteps, had gone silent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe a deer, but no animal moves like that. No animal stops when you start paying attention. Minutes passed. I didn't move, barely even breathed. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, just the rain. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually exhaustion won. My body relaxed, and my mind started to drift. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were slower, closer. I felt something press against the side of my tent. Not hard, just enough to make the fabric shift. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers gripped the handle of my knife, the only thing between me and whatever was outside. Then nothing. The pressure disappeared. The footsteps faded. The rain continued. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking up to the gray light of morning. My first thought was that maybe it had been a dream, a mix of exhaustion and paranoia playing tricks on me. But then I stepped outside. The leaves around my tent had been disturbed. Not by rain, not by wind, by something moving. I looked around, scanning the trees, the old stones. Nothing. No signs of anyone else, no footprints. Then I saw it. A single mark on the side of my tent. A long, thin scratch in the fabric, just inches from where my head had been. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking despite the morning chill. I didn't stop to eat, didn't take my time. I just wanted to leave. The walk back to my truck felt longer than before. The forest was still too quiet, the air too heavy. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else, something I don't have words for. All I know is that I'll never camp in a graveyard again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The plan was simple. 3 days camping in the remote parts of Scotland, away from the noise of the city. I had done solo trips before, but this one felt different. I had chosen a spot far from any usual trails, deep in the Cairngorms. No phone signal, no traffic, just pure isolation. That was exactly what I wanted until I realized how bad of an idea that was. The first day went smoothly. I parked my car at the closest road pull-off, a good 5 miles from where I planned to set up camp. I packed light but had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a knife just in case. The walk to the campsite was peaceful. The further I got from the road, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the occasional gusts of wind and the distant caw of birds. It was exactly what I needed. I reached my chosen spot in the late afternoon. It was perfect, a small clearing next to a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick woodland. The trees provided shelter from the wind, and the water source meant I wouldn't have to carry too much. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal, then sat in my camping chair, staring into the flames. It was only then that I noticed something was off. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal noises, had faded. It wasn't completely silent, but something about the atmosphere felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off as nerves. Camping alone in the middle of nowhere does that to you. I got into my tent around 10 p.m. The temperature had dropped even more, and I curled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sound of the river. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something, a branch snapping. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, maybe 50 meters away. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal. But then another snap, closer. My heart started beating faster. Animals don't move like that, slow, deliberate. I grabbed my knife, just in case, and listened. The sounds stopped. I stayed awake for another hour before finally falling asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and I convinced myself I had imagined the noises. I spent the day hiking further into the hills, exploring areas I had marked on my map. The scenery was stunning. Rolling green landscapes, jagged cliffs, and deep forests that felt untouched by time. By late afternoon, I made my way back to camp, feeling at ease again. That feeling didn't last. As I approached my campsite, something felt off. The firewood I had stacked earlier was scattered. My backpack, which I had left outside the tent, was slightly open. I checked inside. Everything was there. Nothing was missing. No signs of animal bites or claw marks. It was as if someone had gone through my things but decided not to take anything. I looked around, scanning the treeline. Nothing. No movement. No sound. The air had that same heavy stillness as the night before. I told myself it was the wind or maybe my own forgetfulness. I made a fire, cooked my food, and sat there, forcing myself to stay calm. By nightfall, I felt uneasy again. Every small sound made my skin crawl. The fire crackled, and beyond that, silence. No wind, no birds, just stillness. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A branch snapping, closer this time, maybe 20 meters away. I held my breath. Another snap, closer. I slowly reached for my knife. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to give away that I was awake. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, moving through the undergrowth with purpose. My heart pounded in my chest. Then silence. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. No more footsteps, no more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. At first light, I was up. I had barely slept, and my mind felt foggy, but I knew one thing. I had to leave. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. As I rolled up my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare footprints. Human. And they circled my tent. My body went cold. Someone had been outside my tent, walking around it while I slept. Watching. I grabbed my bag and left without looking back. My knife stayed in my hand the entire hike back to the car. The walk felt longer than before, every rustling leaf making me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I reached my car just after noon. I threw my bag in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. I never went back to that spot, and I never camp alone anymore. I don't camp often, but when I do, I like to go alone. It's not that I don't enjoy company. I do, but I find something peaceful about being by myself in the woods, away from everything. No cars, no people, no noise except the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of an animal in the underbrush. It's a kind of quiet that doesn't exist anywhere else. That's why, one late autumn, I packed my gear and headed out to a remote part of the woods about 50 miles from the nearest town. I had been to this area before, but never too deep in. I wanted to push further this time, to find a spot where I could feel completely cut off from the world. I had a 4-day trip planned, just me, my tent, and my rifle in case of any dangerous wildlife. The forecast had mentioned light rain, but I wasn't too worried. I had a good tent and I knew how to set up a dry campsite. I drove as far as the dirt roads allowed, then hiked in for about 4 hours, going deeper than I ever had before. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by dense pines. The ground was flat, and there were no signs of recent activity, human or animal. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, I leaned back against a fallen log and just listened to the sounds of the forest. A few distant caws from birds settling in for the night, the faint trickle of the creek, the wind moving through the trees. Then the rain started. It was light at first, just a soft tapping on the leaves above. I wasn't too concerned. I put my fire out before it got too wet and retreated into my tent. The rain picked up quickly, turning from a drizzle into a steady downpour. I listened to it drum against the fabric of my tent, feeling safe and dry inside. Hours passed. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to a strange sound outside. It wasn't the rain, that was still falling, heavier now. This was something else. A soft crunching like footsteps on damp leaves. I stayed still, listening. Could have been an animal, but something about it felt off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I reached for my rifle, my fingers tightening around the cold metal. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, listening for any more movement. But all I heard was the rain. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the rain had slowed, but the ground was soaked. I stepped out of my tent and immediately noticed something was wrong. There were footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, human, barefoot. They circled my tent. My stomach tightened. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night while I had been sleeping. I packed up faster than I ever had before. I wasn't going to stick around to see who or what had been watching me. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made my pulse jump. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors before even starting the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that part of the woods. I was camping alone in the forests of southern France when I saw her. It was the summer of 2018, and I had taken time off work to explore the countryside. I wanted to disconnect from everything, no phone, no emails, no stress. I packed my car with supplies, drove for hours into the countryside, and picked a remote spot deep in the woods. The area was rugged, with thick trees stretching for miles, no roads nearby, and barely any signs of human activity. It was exactly what I was looking for. I found a clearing by a small stream and set up my tent. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Felt peaceful. I spent the evening collecting firewood, boiling water, and cooking a simple meal. As the light faded, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, enjoying the stillness of the forest. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped slightly, and the woods had become eerily quiet. I heard the occasional crack of a branch in the distance, but I chalked it up to animals moving through the undergrowth. I went to sleep early, curled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. It was a noise, subtle but distinct, a rustling sound, too heavy to be the wind, too deliberate to be an animal. It was close. I held my breath and listened. The sound came from just beyond my tent, moving through the leaves. Slow, careful footsteps. Someone or something was out there. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. But then I heard breathing. Shallow, uneven breathing, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, listening, barely daring to breathe myself. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest was silent again. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any noise. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. I woke up at dawn, the first light filtering through the trees. I stepped outside my tent and looked around, trying to convince myself that last night had been a dream. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Bare footprints, small but clear, pressed into the dirt just outside my tent. They led from the trees to the side of my tent, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. The prints were fresh. Someone had been there, standing outside my tent in the middle of the night, listening to me sleep. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was out here in the middle of nowhere without shoes? And why had they come so close? I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself that it was probably just a lost hiker, maybe even a local living off the land. The thought was unsettling, but I had come out here to enjoy nature, and I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my trip. I spent the day hiking, keeping my mind busy. I climbed a nearby hill and sat at the top, looking out over the endless stretch of forest. There wasn't a single sign of civilization in sight. I returned to my campsite in the late afternoon and found everything exactly as I had left it. No more footprints, no signs of disturbance. I felt a little better. As night fell, I built another fire and ate dinner. The unease from the night before was still there, but I tried to ignore it. I sat by the fire until late, watching the embers glow against the darkness. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. It happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My entire body tensed. Then, something touched the fabric of my tent. A light press, like fingertips trailing along the material. I stopped breathing. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound faded. The footsteps moved away, deeper into the woods. I lay there, frozen, until the sun began to rise. I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt watched. As I loaded my backpack, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. A figure. A woman. Standing just inside the treeline, barefoot and motionless. She was thin, her clothes tattered and dirty. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging over her face. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked back into the forest. I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't run. I didn't want her to think I was afraid. But I walked quickly, never looking back, my heart pounding the entire time. It took me hours to get back to my car. When I finally reached it, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. Who was she? Why had she been watching me? I don't know. I don't want to know. I never went camping alone again. I had been planning the hunting trip for months. The season had just opened, and I had found a remote area deep in the woods where I was sure I wouldn't run into many other people. That was the way I liked it. I wasn't one for crowded hunting grounds or busy campsites. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the kind of peace you only find miles away from the nearest road. I left early in the morning, my truck packed with supplies: tent, sleeping bag, rifle, enough food and water for a few days, and a cooler for whatever I managed to bag. The drive took nearly 5 hours, the roads turning from pavement to gravel to dirt as I pushed further into the wilderness. The last stretch was barely a road at all, just 2 worn tire tracks cutting through the trees. I found a good spot to set up camp about a mile away from the base of a ridge. There was a clearing with enough space for my tent and a fire, and a small stream running nearby for water. The forest around me was dense, tall pines and thick underbrush, the kind of place where an animal could disappear in seconds. It was perfect. I spent the first few hours setting up my tent and organizing my gear. The air was cool, the kind of crisp autumn weather that made hunting season feel just right. I built a small fire as the sun dipped below the treetops, ate a quick meal, and checked my rifle. Everything was ready for the next morning. The woods were quiet that night, but not completely silent. I heard the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft trickle of the stream. Normal sounds, nothing that put me on edge. I woke before dawn, slipping out of my sleeping bag and pulling on my gear. The world was still dark, but I had a headlamp and a good sense of direction. I grabbed my rifle and set out toward the ridge, moving carefully, keeping my steps light. The morning was slow. I saw tracks, signs that deer had passed through recently, but nothing close enough for a shot. I kept moving, scanning the trees, pausing now and then to listen. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I spotted a buck standing near a fallen log, half hidden in the shadows. I raised my rifle, steadying my breath, lining up the shot. The moment stretched, the forest holding its breath with me. And then, just as I squeezed the trigger, something moved in the trees behind the deer. A shape, a flicker of motion, something that shouldn't have been there. The shot went wide. The buck bolted, disappearing into the trees. My heart was pounding, but not from excitement. I lowered my rifle, staring at the spot where I had seen the movement. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A trick of the light, maybe, but the more I looked, the less sure I was. The undergrowth was still shifting, branches swaying slightly as if someone or something had just passed through. I stayed there for a long moment, watching, listening, but nothing else moved. The forest was still. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. Maybe I had just spooked myself. I had been alone out here for hours, my mind focused on the hunt. It wasn't unusual to get a little jumpy. I decided to head back to camp before it got too dark. I moved carefully, keeping my rifle ready, but I didn't see anything else out of the ordinary. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and red. I built up the fire, ate another meal, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. It was just a missed shot, I told myself, just a long day in the woods. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper against the wind. A rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate, too steady to be an animal. I held my breath, listening. The sound grew closer, then stopped. Silence stretched around me, heavy and unnatural. Then, just outside my tent, I heard it, breathing, deep, steady breathing. Not animal-like, not the quick, cautious breaths of a deer or a bear sniffing around camp. This was different. This was human. I lay completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for my rifle, moving as quietly as I could. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Minutes passed. The breathing continued. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited. I strained to hear any movement, any sign that the person, or whatever it was still there. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. Morning came, and with it, the rational part of my mind tried to explain what had happened. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe I had just imagined the breathing. The wind could do strange things in the woods. I forced myself to go about my day as usual. I checked my gear, made breakfast, and set out for another hunt. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods felt different. The silence was too deep, the trees too still. Every time I stopped walking, I swore I could hear something behind me. Faint, distant footsteps that stopped the moment I turned around. By late afternoon, I had had enough. I decided to cut the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to spend another night with it. I packed up my camp quickly, throwing my gear into the truck without taking the time to organize it properly. The sun was setting as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. And then, as I looked up, I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. Tall, thin, its features obscured by distance and failing light. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into gear, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow path. My hands were tight on the wheel, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was still there. I drove until I reached the main road, until the dense woods gave way to open land. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I never went back to that spot. I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe another hunter who had been out there for his own reasons. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Because when I checked my campsite later, looking through the photos I had taken that day, I found something. A picture of the ridge where I had missed my shot. A picture I had taken without thinking. And in the background, among the trees, there was a figure standing there, watching me,